thank you everyone who's attending, and really excited to offer another episode of the PES Region 1 to 7 student podcast. Our guest today is Mr. Doug Houseman. We're really excited to have him on. As you might have heard us mentioning, he is a really seriously involved, broad knowledge kind of person, and does not sit still. It seems he's done a lot, and he's still doing a lot. And so I'll just start out introducing the co-panelists today. We have Hasala and Conrad, and we've got Adamir and Paul from Kelowna, and every single one of them have been instrumental in organizing, making flyers, making the events, trying to get the social media activity. And today we've got 50 registrations, and we're really proud of that. And please tell people, and please help. This is for you guys. So the more we promote it, the better it'll get. And I'll start right out with Doug's bio here. Our guest today, Mr. Doug Houseman, is a longtime member in the IEEE, off and on, as he will tell you. He started life in an electrical family and wandered through many life changes, goal changes, and finally settled back in the electrical world. And he has been lucky enough to work for utilities around the world, from Antarctica to Canada, and from Chile to Norway. And he has been luckier than ever to get a chance to lead committees and working groups full of people who are way smarter than he is. And the IEEE, the NIST, DOE, EU, GWAC, and more have given him a chance to learn and make a difference. So now he is mostly giving back to young engineers like us at his place of work and at his many clients. So thank you for joining us, Doug. Welcome. And sorry, Doug doesn't have video today, and he'll attest to the broadband limitations in his part of the world for that problem.
Well, thank you for all the alphabet soup. I think we get a whole box of alphabets out of that.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased.
What is the GWAC?
It's the Gridwise Architecture Council.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add to that bio, Doug, besides that?
No, after 50 years, you can say whatever you want to say. It doesn't hurt me.
Okay. That's great. So today, anyone, please, if you have questions, you can use the raise your hand button or type in the chat. Address it to whoever you want, however you want. And we really encourage participation. That'd be great. Doug would really like that. We'd like that. So yeah, so this is for the young professionals. This is for young engineers. And I guess we could start off just by starting off at the beginning of your career, Doug, to give us some perspective on how it can go. Why did you choose the electrical engineering sector? How did you end up in this field?
I didn't choose it, it chose me. So I grew up on a farm. My grandfather was a utility carpenter, something that no longer exists, where he went out in the woods and cut trees down to turn them into poles and buildings and other things for the utility.
Wow.
And he'd take a train that would be his train out into the woods for a week at a time with 20 or 30 apprentices, and they'd chop down trees. So it was almost like logging.
Wow.
And my dad ended up becoming a lineman and doing other jobs as well, but always kept doing at least some line work. And by the time I was 9, when he got called out for an emergency, I ended up sitting in the other seat in the truck. And so I'd run and fetch tools, I'd run and fetch parts, I'd run and fetch anything you want. Back in the day, that was called a gopher. And you'd go for this and go for that and go for something else and put them in the little bucket, and he'd pull it up on the line and do his work. Well, it only took me a couple of years before I stopped being just a ground gopher and started going up the poles.
Wow. What was your impression of your idea, I guess, limited idea of what the electrical grid was back then? How did it strike you in that work?
Well, I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, so something called underground didn't exist. transmission in the UP back in the day was 20 kV, and distribution lines were 5 kV.
Wow.
So that was my picture of the industry back in the day.
Right.
You know, you could fit a whole substation in your bedroom.
Wow.
Sometimes they put it on a platform between two poles.
Wow.
So I managed to get myself in the Navy and out of town because I really wanted to be a welder, because Mr. Shampo had the welding shop and he was getting close to retiring. He was the only one who had year-round indoor work in town. And I thought that'd be really cool. So the Navy said they'd make me a welder. I went off to school, turned into a welder, went off to a little place in Southeast Asia, came back from that, went to work on a floating dry dock. I thought that was pretty good, but my boss decided I needed to be an engineer rather than an enlisted person. And he arranged for me to go off to college. Well, I still hadn't figured out that electricity was going to be part of my career. So my first degree is in naval architecture and my second in marine engineering.
Wow.
One of the nicest things about learning naval architecture is a ship is nothing more than a floating microgrid.
Mm-hmm.
You can bring it in and dock it to the regular grid. You can even deliver power to the regular grid. But when you're at sea, you're an independent power system. So I went to
Wow, what
school,
a
got to my
great
first.
early precursor. That's a really great early precursor to the microgrid work you do now. That is a perfect little microcosm of it.
Yep. So I got out to my first duty station and somebody was talking about all the power was off to several piers in San Diego. And I'm sitting around the corner and listening to them describe it and saying they can't figure out what it is. And I piped up without having any clue who was around the corner. Well, it's either this or this, and you're going to need this part, this part, this part if it's that, and this other part if it's the other thing. And so you might as well order all four parts. And the admiral who was in charge of the base, now realize I'm a fresh caught ensign, the lowest of the low in the officer ranks. And I've got a salty admiral coming out at me who's got 35 years of Navy time. And he said, "Who said that?" And I kind of slumped down in my chair and raised my hand. And he said, "Come with me."
Very nice.
And so I ended up back in the electrical industry in the Navy and did another 13 years of that kind of work aboard ship and on bases, and finally ended up at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, designing all electric ships and other useful things like rail guns that could be used on ships that were powered by electricity.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. What is it like to work as and being an employee at DARPA? What is that like? Well, that's amazing.
I wasn't technically an employee of DARPA. Right. I was a naval officer and seconded. But if you want to work with really, really smart people,
yeah,
who also know which end of a wrench is which, you know, right. Normally those two skills don't go together.
Sure.
I'm a really smart engineer, but if you hand me a wrench, I'm going to hold it by the wrong end.
Yeah, they're interested in tangible results. That's their main goal, right? Making real things without real applications.
But it was a lot of fun because we'd bounce ideas off of each other and then build models and you know, smoke test them. Everybody knows what a smoke test is, right?
It's bound to smoke up.
Plug it in and see if you let all the magic smoke out of the chips. If you do, it doesn't work.
Right. I mean, if you had less simulation power back then, you had to plug it in at some point.
Well,
Yeah,
we learned to fail fast. How fast can we solder it together and get it plugged into the wall?
amazing. And so how's the latter half of your career been, and how's the industry changed and you with it?
So I screwed up my knee, and the Navy said bye bye.
Hmm.
And some friends of mine from the Navy at Dayton Power and Light said, "How about you build us a digital power plant?" So I spent 6 months turning an all analog instrumented 1 gigawatt coal fired power plant into a fully digital power plant running on a stack of 11 Macintosh tubes. So it's still back in the day of primitive Stone Age tinkering when it comes to computers.
And those Macs are still running today, right?
They replaced that system a year ago.
Yeah, yeah. Those computers are amazing.
And here's the fun part. They replaced that stack of 11 Macintosh 2s with a Mac Mini.
Wow.
So they got their whole janitorial closet back.
Wow. Just in a drawer. The whole system's in a drawer now. That's
Well,
great.
the plant is getting shut down here in the very near future, so they just needed to keep it running through about 12 more months.
Right.
But from
Right.
there, I formed my own company, sold that company to Capgemini, became the CTO for Capgemini globally for the utility industry. Spent 16 years there, much of it working in Canada, other parts of it working in Europe and China, um, South America, Africa, and some of my favorite time was spent in Australia working down under.
Nice.
For
Yeah.
10 years I made 13 28-day trips around the world each year.
Wow.
So I was putting about a 500,000 miles on an airplane a year.
Wow. Jeez.
Doug, just one question. What's the main difference that you saw, like coming traveling by different countries, like work with different cultures?
Every country is unique. Every country has some really nice advantages and things I love about the culture. And every country has some oddities that make it hard to figure out exactly how to get the most out of the people you're working with. So finding a person who is a local native and really understands the culture to get to work alongside of you is critical to getting the best results out of your projects.
No doubt. Yeah. That human connection can be a door into a lot more clear lines of communication and help and work. And I wonder what are some common weak points that you noticed that was like kind of common to a lot of the places you visited, the weak points in a system, specifically talking about power utilities, and then what are some of the things you noticed in common when places did things right? What were those two commonalities when places did things wrong and places did things right?
I think the biggest commonality for a problem worldwide is we build the grid skinny with not a lot of extra capacity, and we tend to run the minimum amount of infrastructure we can, and then we're limited in the amount of money that we have to maintain it.
Hmm.
So the grid is always sensitive to storms, accidents, riots, or anything else. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the vice president of Sierra Leone, when I brought a team of IEEE volunteers down after the Civil War to help get the grid back up, said it the best. He said electricity is the thin veneer between civilization and savagery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't think anybody realizes what happens if you turn the power off for 3 or 4 weeks and people start to worry about food and is it ever coming back on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent over 100,000 years as a species, as a tribal animal. And we tend to return to that tribal safety, like me, not like me, when things get bad. We've got to
Mm-hmm.
learn to move away from that. And we've got to realize that we've got to build a more robust system if we're going to have a stable world going forward and if we're going to meet our sustainability goals.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the kind of the utopian dream that a lot of the discourse is about in electrical engineering in the power and energy kind of sector. In if there was some ultimate future where every single household was truly independent power-wise, that entire scenario you're talking about would be way less likely. And do you see momentum for that, or is there not enough impetus within people in culturally, or is there too many vested interests on the corporate side that are preventing such a thing from happening? Or I know it's very utopian.
None of that is the problem.
Right.
The problem is the way that people treat technology. When's the last time you went through a building and cleaned all the sewer mains and ran ultrasonic scans on them to make sure there was enough pipe thickness that they weren't going to break?
Never ever.
Okay. That is a recommended practice. When's the last time you actually crawled under a vehicle and changed your own oil?
When I owned a vehicle, yeah, at least once or twice a year. But
You yourself,
yeah.
or took it to an oil change place?
Me myself, yeah.
Okay.
My vehicle was so rusty that I could rarely find a shop that would put it on their hoist. So that's where I was at.
But most people don't do their own.
No,
And if you're
no.
going to put something that is going to provide the amount of power that they need for a year,
Mm-hmm.
and if you want to have fun, look up how many joules are in a megawatt hour, and then look up how many joules are in a pound of TNT.
Mm.
And think about how much TNT you would have to have in your house if you were independent and had a year's worth of energy in whatever was providing your energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it won't be solar cells, because there's no place in the world where, for an average house size, enough sunlight falls on your roof, even if you had 100% perfect solar cells.
Yeah, yeah.
So you'd have to have a Mr. Fusion or a fissional device or storage or whatever. But an average home in North America uses 8 megawatt hours a year.
Yeah.
So for whatever you looked up for 1 megawatt hour, you'd have to multiply it by 8. And since you're going to be an engineer and you're going to live in a larger than average dwelling, and you're going to have more electronics than an average person does, because you're an engineer, you're not going to have 8 megawatt hours in your house. You're probably going to have 16 or 20.
So it's
Now,
truly utopian to think at this point that people would be able to, there'd be enough. The technology is a decades and decades away from that ever happening right now. So
I'm not going to say it's decades and decades away.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it's going to take a breakthrough in fusion.
Mm.
And then it's going to take significant work to make a fusion device customer, what's the best way to, customer proof.
Right. Right.
It's just going to have to go into the foundation and run for 100 years by dripping a little bit of water into it.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah, that would be incredible. And circling back to the grids, what are some of the commonalities you saw with the places you visited that really did things well? What was that?
Well, I think that, you know, in North America, we probably made a huge mistake by going to single phase. As we get electric vehicles, as we electrify buildings and so on, it's going to be a lot harder in North America to do what our European or Asian colleagues do with a three-phase system. They're going to be able to get a lot more power to a location with a lot less in the way of problems compared to what they've got today, because everything is three-phase. So there's much less worry about voltage imbalance or power imbalance. You don't have to worry about going out and moving transformers and a lot of other things. Now, many homes are only connected to a single phase, but 3 homes along the street might be A, B, and C phase,
Right.
so that you got a closer balance than you do in North America.
What are
The
some of the
other-
ways
the-
that you mitigate it in North America that are actually viable for the future without having to overhaul the whole system? What are some of the strategies we're using right now to mitigate that problem?
We can't mitigate that problem and not overhaul the system.
Right. Okay.
So distribution circuits that are 34, 5, 35 kV, if they were built small enough, probably will be able to deliver enough power. But think about it this way. I buy a house with a 2-car garage and I park 2 cars in it, which is the ultimate dream, right?
Right.
My 2 cars are made by GM. Okay, so there's 20 kW for one car, 20 kW for another car. Then I put in an air source heat pump. In the summer, that's great because it's 5 kW, but in the winter, when it gets down below 0 Fahrenheit, that air source heat pump turns into baseboard heating. There's another 20 kW. Now we add our traditional 3.7 kW per household on average, and we go from 3.7 kW to 63.7 kW. Right now, most of our circuits are built and designed to already be at 80% of their ultimate load when we install them.
Mm.
It's way more than 20% more from that 3.7 kW that's the average today to that 63.7 kW that's coming in the future.
Yeah. Wow.
And most people haven't caught on to that yet. They think, oh yeah, I'll throw a little solar on my roof. Okay, if I'm living in Ottawa and I have 2 electric vehicles and it's the middle of December, I need a little over 400 kilowatts of solar to be able to run my house through the winter.
Wow. I think this is coming from a completely novice perspective, as I am. I stupidly did not introduce myself. I'm between my 2nd and 3rd year of electrical engineering at BCIT in Vancouver. So I have so much to learn. This is just throwing darts at a dartboard for me. But I wonder, could North America pivot using the existing single phase system? Could they pivot in some places to high voltage DC? Is that viable?
It's potentially viable, but how do we build a switching device that every time we open the switch, we don't create an arc flash?
Hmm.
AC works very well for us because we've got a zero crossing.
Yes.
And so that limits our arc flash potential. In DC, you don't have a zero crossing unless you force it. And by the way, if you want to be rich, coming up with a good zero crossing DC switch
Right. Right.
will make you a pile of money if you can figure out how to do it so it's reliable and economical to build.
Wow. Okay. How about a little mini lesson? What if you could elaborate on what is the problem of actually trying to make that switching device? Just a Cole's Notes version, just for the people who want a little more technicality in the seminar here.
Okay, so in a typical DC system, you both have a positive and a negative voltage, right? And let's just say we're using 1,000 volts, which is, until you get into HVDC for transmission, about the most anybody wants to work with in a factory or a commercial building. And in fact, if you look at the eMERGE standards, it's 380 volts for the higher voltage and 12 volts for the lower voltage for DC.
Wow.
But at 1,000 volts, running at full energy, you need to find enough energy in order to be able to drive that voltage down for a very short period of time using some sort of pulse. How do you accumulate that energy? Once you've accumulated that energy, how do you apply that energy to drive that down to zero? And during that microsecond, how do you control the switch so it opens or closes during that microsecond?
Wow. That's amazing. That's interesting. Yeah, that's going to be a very interesting research.
That's going to earn somebody a PhD and somebody's professor a couple of patents, a new business, and probably $1 billion in licensing.
So if you were to take out your magic crystal ball, and you know that the grids are stressed in North America, specifically with the path we've chosen with single phase, what do you think is the most likely thing that utilities are going to try to get out? Would some of them invest in heavy R&D for this possible high voltage DC solution using existing infrastructure?
I don't think the utilities will, but the Canadian, the US, and the Mexican governments will.
Right.
You're going to see DOE and ARPA-E money going into laboratories to try and come up with that stuff. You're also going to see a lot more work on solid state transformers and other solid state equipment, which may be able to make some of that easier. Now, are we going to have mixed AC DC systems? Absolutely. One of the nice things about a solid state transformer is you bring ugly power quality AC in on one side. It turns into DC. Now you want to add more, you can plug your solar right in there without an inverter. You want to take some out, you can plug your car into that center point and pull DC out without an inverter. You may need to do some voltage regulation, but you can steal out of the center of that core. Then on the other side, you make perfect AC power. All the harmonics go away. All of the flicker potential goes away. You got 60 hertz. You don't have to worry about what the whole grid is doing, and so on and so forth.
Wow.
So those solid state transformers that some of the power electronics people call energy routers are coming. We've already got a few thousand of them in the grid to play with, but we're learning all the time about some of the downsides and what we got to do to make them better.
Yeah. Conrad or Hasala, I know Conrad, your PhD is has some relevance to some of this solid state or at least microgrid sensing technologies. Did you have more to add?
Oh, can I ask a question, Clinton?
Absolutely, please do.
So in the news about a month ago, I saw that in UK they had set up or they're installing a smart wires project, and I'm sure, Doug, that you have been reading and you have been working with these folks. You know what they're doing. It was Dr. Deepak Diwan from Georgia Tech. Those folks who started that up. So, what's your take on using the existing infrastructure and improving? Improving the facts-based facts-based uh, paths towards a better utilization of the existing grid. So, what's your take on that? Is that a possible path?
It's a part, but understand something. There are physical limits to a conductor at an ambient temperature, no matter what you do to play with the power angle and so on and so forth. You can kind of think of reactive power or VARs as sort of grease that you put on the power line in order to make the real power move down the power line with less friction, which we talk about as impedance. And there's a limit to how much of that you can apply before you don't get any better results. If what you're looking for is to get 10 or 15% improvement in power delivery, the folks in Sydney, Australia have been doing that since the 1960s and re-rating all of the feeders in the downtown area since the 1960s. It works. It works quite well. But if you want to double, triple, or quadruple the amount of power going over that line, you're going to pay for it in additional losses, because at some point the additional VARs aren't going to help you anymore. And in a typical college town, taking it from its existing infrastructure to an all electric infrastructure means that that college town is going to have to deal with about 3 times as many kilowatt hours over the course of a year as it does today.
Yeah, no doubt.
Think about it. A gallon of gasoline, about 3.5 liters, has about 42 kilowatt hours in it and weighs about 3.25 kilos. If I take lithium ion batteries, 3 kilos of lithium ion batteries is about 1 kilowatt hour.
Wow.
So I need about 130 kilos of lithium, of the best lithium ion batteries, to equal a 1 gallon can of gasoline.
Wow.
Fossil fuel is incredibly energy dense. And we need to realize that. We've got 110 kilowatt hours in the new Ford Lightning. Okay. That's about 2.5 gallons of gasoline.
That's really mind-blowing when you put it like that. You just imagine a truck that big with a tiny little gas tank.
Now, that's already had all the losses taken out of it in the way of that electricity.
Right.
So you're really talking about the 110 kilowatt hours being the equivalent of about 15 gallons of gasoline in terms of usable energy. But 15 gallons of gasoline weighs a little under 100 pounds. That same amount in lithium ion batteries, and some of the best made on the planet, is 1,800 pounds, or just shy of a metric ton.
Wow. Yeah, the upcoming stress on the grid in the next 20 or 30 years, with all these countries making the news every other week, every other month, saying they're going to be banning the sale of gasoline vehicles and the new regulations. It seems as if there's a lot of political will to make these headlines and make these regulations, but I'm skeptical that there's as much investing in the engineering and planning behind the scenes to prepare for such an incredible draw on the system. What do you see?
I see that, and I'll talk about Europe here. Back in 1990, 30 years ago, Europe put a proclamation together through the EU that was called in Europe 2020. 20% reduction in CO2 by the year 2020. Okay. We are still producing in Europe more CO2 than we did in 1990. We have not reduced it by 20%, we've increased it. When the Germans shut down the nuclear power plants, it wasn't wind energy that picked up the slack in Germany. It was their lignite coal plants, the brown coal, which is probably the dirtiest of all coal for CO2 production, that picked up the slack. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. They made a decision based on their national culture, but that meant that they put out a lot more CO2. And it's kind of fun if you watch the pricing map in Europe. France is the lowest price almost all of the time, and a few winter days, instead of selling into the rest of Europe, they start buying. And you can see the price in Europe go up by euros a minute for electricity per megawatt hour when France goes from selling to buying.
Wow.
In 30 minutes, it will typically double the whole European price for electricity.
And what differentiates France?
France is almost entirely nuclear.
Okay.
Close to 80% of their power is nuclear. Most of the rest of it is hydro. So from an electricity point of view, when you talk about greenhouse gases, France is probably the cleanest country in the world for production of power.
Wow. I was gonna definitely, we've got about 20 minutes left in the conversation, and I wanted to come back around to all the young professionals attending and students attending today, and definitely give the opportunity on what do you think really is going to help us coming into our careers and having a fulfilling career. Mainly, let's start with just getting started. What does it take to secure a good job, a satisfying position to start off in?
Being very honest in your resume. What did you learn? What did you not learn? What topics are your favorite topics? Just because you're coming out with a EE degree doesn't mean you all have the same background.
Right.
Some people took several microelectronics classes. Other people took communications classes. Other people took power classes. Others took power electronics classes. Be clear about what you took, what you enjoyed, and what you like to do. Because most companies aren't just looking for a person to plug in, they are looking for somebody to take a role and be somebody who can take over a job, and preferably a job that they enjoy so that they stay in that job for 6 or 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
Your generation right now among older engineers is that you don't stick to a job.
Yeah. Yeah.
That a year or two and you're bored and off you go someplace else.
Yeah.
The second thing is, once you get a job, take 3 or 4 weeks and figure out who you want as a mentor in that organization, and then approach them and ask them to be your mentor. Don't wait for them to come to you. Go to them and be ready to explain why you think they would be a good mentor for you. If you're going to stick in the organization, you're going to eventually want 2 mentors. You're going to want a technical mentor that's going to help you get better with the subject matter. And eventually you're going to want an organizational mentor to help steer you in the right way to move up in the organization into the role that you eventually want.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just want to be a principal engineer. They're perfectly happy there. They can become a technical specialist and they can keep working on the gear.
Mm-hmm.
Other people want to manage people. And so they want to get to a manager, a director, maybe eventually a VP or something along those lines. Realize that if you're going in thinking that you eventually want to be the CEO of a utility, that you're going to need 2 more degrees at a minimum.
Mm.
You're going to need an MBA because you're going to have to learn the financial side of the business. And then you're going to have to go to law school.
Oh, man.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look at the CEOs of most major utilities at this point, and they have a legal background because guess what? It's the regulators who control how much money a utility can make. It's not the technologists.
Mm-hmm. As a mentor, Doug, that you have been, what is a quality in a mentee that you really like to see? That what do you see as kind of a precursor to someone who later on is successful?
I think the first thing is they like to learn. You know, I've been in the industry for 50 years and I still spend an hour a day doing research. If you ever lose that desire to learn new things, it's probably time to find a new job or to order a coffin.
Yeah.
The second thing
yeah.
that I think takes for people to really succeed in the industry is an ability to think a little further than the person sitting next to you.
Mm.
Sometimes it's about the changes that the grid is going to have to survive through. Sometimes it's about potential changes to equipment. Sometimes it's changes to standards. Sometimes it's changes to how we do things. And realize in the typical utility, it's about 20% the cost of equipment and 80% the cost of getting it installed.
Mm.
So if you make a dime change in a transformer, that's great. But if you can make that same improvement as a percentage in the work that's required to get that transformer installed, you're a
Mm.
hero.
Wow. Yeah, that is something we absolutely have not really stressed that much so far in my post-secondary education. That's really interesting, Doug. I like that a lot. Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, I before I went to school, I'm a kind of a late bloomer. I just worked in trades pretty much my whole life since I was a teenager, and the cost of that labor is immense compared. And I totally get what you're saying, but I had not thought of that. The design aspect of engineering things for the installer, for the technician is crucial. Absolutely.
You know, if you can
Yeah.
put a cap bank below a line and far enough away that you don't have to worry about any interference or anything else, and you've got enough room between the communication zone and the hot zone, that cap bank, when it's disconnected from the grid, can be worked by almost anybody. So if what you need to do is go change a relay or a timer or a radio, then somebody who's not qualified as a lineman can go do that work.
Wow.
That's a big difference in the cost, and it's a big difference in the setup and teardown time at the location and the permissions that are required to be able to do that work.
Mm-hmm. No
A
doubt.
good planning engineer is constantly looking at how do we do it better. And if you do a good job at that as a planning engineer, eventually you'll get to one of the coolest jobs in the industry, which is a standards engineer, where you're figuring out how to put all the Legos together.
Right. Right. Yeah, that is, and the consequences cascade out from there. It's a very complex thing to make standards. I'm guessing, just for all the unintended consequences of your decisions. It must be a very important job.
Well, it's probably one of the most important jobs in a utility. And if you can get assigned as a junior engineer to help do some of the research, you're going to know more about how things go together and why faster than any of the other young engineers.
Hmm. Yeah, and just to prompt more people, it'd be great if anyone watching would like to throw some questions here, or Paul or Adamir, if you guys had some questions, would love to hear some diversity of thoughts or anything. Feel free to enter in the chat. We've got a little bit more time. We usually like to keep the podcast to an hour, so we got like 10 more minutes here. And I did want to ask you one question, while we're waiting on some other questions. If you mentioned the regulatory problems, that if you could snap your fingers and change one regulation right now, no problem, no questions asked, what is the one thing you think that's holding things back in your locale from where you work?
I don't think it's really holding things back, but I think it's going to be a problem as we go for electrification. I would like to see the term used and useful mean 25% loading or more, rather than, as most regulators look at it, 80% loading or more.
Hmm.
So encourage people to put extra capability into the circuits that they're putting out there now. You know, typical utility from the time they put up a distribution circuit until they take it down and replace it is 80 years. We're
Wow.
30 years away from 2050, when we're supposed to be fully electrified.
Hmm.
If we keep for the next 7 or 8 years putting the same thing out there under the same regulations, we'll go from 30 years to 20 years, and we're going to be taking things that we've deployed in the last 8 years and replacing them.
Yeah.
That's a waste of capital. It's a waste of scarce labor,
Hmm.
and it's going to be a real problem.
Yeah.
Think about taking down every single distribution line, digging up every single distribution line all over the world and replacing them in the next 25 years.
Yeah.
It took us 120 years to get here. Some of the infrastructure that's out there is over 100 years old.
Hmm.
And now we've got to replace it all in probably 20 years or less.
Mm. That's interesting because you have been all around the world, and that kind of sparked a thought that I bet some developing nations are going to have an advantage in that they don't have a bunch of this old infrastructure that they have to navigate, like just demolishing it or upgrading it. They have that's kind of fresh slate advantage in some places. I mean, I bet coming from me in Canada is kind of rich for someone who has no electricity, but it is an aspect.
It definitely is an aspect, and thinking differently about what power is needed, what people are used to, how you ramp power usage in a country that never had it before.
Mm.
Some of the work that I did in the 1970s in Kenya was putting up windmills, not wind
Wow.
turbines, windmills.
Oh, okay, okay.
And their purpose was to pump water out of the ground. Now, when the storage tank at the top of the windmill tower was full, you could switch that windmill to charge DC batteries like we use in a car.
Wow.
And that provided some electrical power for use in the village.
Right.
And we got to think about what can be maintained in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
And for people like the Maasai in Africa, everything has to be portable
Mm.
because as their cattle feed, they move and they make a big circle through the course of the year in order to have good grazing land for their cattle. So if you're going to give them an electrical system, that electrical system has to be light enough and come down in small enough components
Mm-hmm.
and be easy enough to set up and rugged enough that they can set it up and take it down every day.
Mm-hmm.
Think about taking down the infrastructure for Toronto every day and moving Toronto every
Yeah,
day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'll ask you the same question. If you could snap your fingers and make it appear, not regulatory this time, but a technological advancement, if it could appear, what do you think would be the most impactful thing that could develop if you could magically?
If we could magically develop Mr. Fusion,
Yeah, yeah.
it would change the whole world in the fact that we're post scarcity on energy and most materials,
Yeah.
would change the whole world about who has enough and who doesn't have enough and how fast economic growth could happen and other things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if Mr. Fusion was available and cheap, we could move all food growing indoors
Yeah.
and have a year-round growing season at very dense levels and be able to crank out far more food than we can with our modern day agriculture. Right now, indoor agriculture is mostly dragged down by the cost of energy.
Yeah.
You know,
Do you have faith? Do you have faith as far as what you've seen development-wise? You being more having a career behind you and knowing what is kind of actually real results and what isn't. Do you have some faith in the way things are going with fusion?
I think that the big governments have made a mistake with the tokamak and some of the other
Mm.
multi-billion-dollar fusion projects, and you start looking at ZAP and some of the other startups in the fusion space. I think they may actually have taken a number of lessons and worked the physics a little differently. And so instead of saying fusion is a rolling 20 years away, I would say that fusion today may be a rolling 10 years away,
Mm,
and maybe only 3 10-year cycles before we get it.
wow. Yeah, and it's always a shame to see that these multi-billion dollar projects are not only expensive, but the scale or something about the way they've bitten off more than they can chew. It seems like they take 10 or 15 or 20 years just to build the prototype. And that's what blows my mind.
Well, Zap has done 3 prototypes, each one better than the last, in 3 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Paul or Adam, did you guys have anything that came to mind as we're closing up here?
Yeah, well, I guess you kind of touched up on that. So Doug, from the grid operator perspective, what would be the changes needed for the grid due to the transition that we're seeing from fossil fuels to renewable resources?
Well, when I started out, a grid operator operating a control area typically had between 100 and 1,500 SCADA points. And that provided them all the information they needed to operate the grid. And you could put a whole year's worth of grid information on a couple of floppy disks, something that were
Wow.
out of circulation before most of you guys were even born. We are now looking at, in order to have enough information to operate the grid, probably 30 data points per premise. And so we're not looking at 500 or 1,500 data points to run a grid area. We're looking at literally hundreds of millions of data points. And that means significant amounts of computing capability and operators who are capable of dealing with the noise of hundreds of millions of data points. You know, at Pacific Gas and Electric, on an average day, the operators have to deal with 2 million alarms. That's not 2 million data points, that's 2 million something went wrong.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So I guess the
And
handling of data is the biggest asset then.
it's an asset, but it's also an anchor,
Mm-hmm.
because you got to develop the right programs to get down to things that really matter, that human operators need to see and deal with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we talk about transactive energy. In an hour in LA, we would need to be able to handle 30 to 40 billion transactions just for electricity. And think about this, Bitcoin handles 7 transactions per second globally.
Right.
Wow.
And that's with a worldwide effort, and it's of some of the best coders and software engineers that have ever done it. So I mean, it's a
people
big
who
problem.
tell you that, you know, that blockchain is going to be the future of electricity. Well, blockchain may consume all of the electricity in the future, but it won't be the way we deal with electricity in the future.
No.
And both China and Iceland are starting to shut down blockchain computing entities because they're consuming so much power.
Yeah.
If we follow the current curve, blockchain will consume more power than the global internet by 2025.
Yeah. Well, last week, China, well, not last week, but very recently in the last month, China shut down over 80%. Well, people voluntarily shut down over 80% of their Bitcoin mining operations in China due to their regulations from the government. So it's an incredibly volatile space. It's just wild. And we have a message also from an attendee saying, thank you, Doug Houseman, for sharing your rich experience. Electric researchers have a long way to reach the sustainable goals. Many problems are still open, and that's from Krishna. Thank you, Krishna. And yeah, just thank you everyone for attending. It's been really great. Doug, we would be honored if you'd come and visit again. There's so much more to ask you. It's really great. You're a good storyteller, but also the breadth and depth of your knowledge is really nice. It's just, my brain is expanding just talking to you. So I thank you for your time. Thank you, Paul and Adamir, for your volunteer. You guys just always holding it together on the back end. And of course, Hasala and Conrad, couldn't do it without you. And Hasala, thank you for bringing on such a wonderful guest. And yeah, and Doug, would you like to promote anything that you're up to these days, or we could post your LinkedIn on the Facebook channel or something? Or
If you post my LinkedIn, then you'll get to see all of the crazy questions I ask the world about the future of the grid. A couple of weeks ago, I asked a series of very hard questions about how do we need to change the energy markets. A few weeks before that, I asked about energy efficiency. They're all good things to think about, and some of those questions are a lot of fun to throw at a professor.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all, and we'll catch up to you someday in the future. Doug, would love to have you back on someday.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
See ya. Take care.